The son of a Presbyterian minister from Ohio and a Southern woman who had nursed Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born December 28, 1856 in Staunton, Virginia, the third of the four children who would accompany their parents in moves over the South. The Wilsons would move from Virginia to Georgia to South Carolina until finally settling in then North Carolina. Known as Tommy to his family, in later years he chose to go by his middle name, Woodrow, explaining that it sounded more sonorous and distinctive. Wilson's mother, Janet Woodrow Wilson, was born in England but grew up in America. Her children were close to her, and Wilson himself said he was a mama's boy. The Presbyterian denomination, like the nation, was divided over the issues which caused the war. The Rev. Wilson was a leader in the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America and would later teach theology at Columbia Theological Seminary and Southwestern Presbyterian Theological University. For the Rev. Wilson, the South was justified in its secession from the Union, a belief which he backed with his religious beliefs. He taught his children to pray daily, to believe that it was God who ordered the universe and the lives of men and women, and in predestination, which held that everything that happened had been ordained in advance by God. Images of the Confederate defeat would brand themselves upon young Wilson's memory as he saw Union troops marching through the city, and he witnessed the sight of Jefferson Davis, who had served as the president of the Confederacy, taken in chains through the city of Augusta. His earliest memories were of the war between the states and the devastation it caused the South. As he grew up in Augusta during Reconstruction, he noted the poverty of the city during those years. During the time when Wilson was a boy, public school access in the South was almost non-existent. Instead, his father served as his first teacher, focusing on British history, religion, and literature. The Rev. Wilson was a scholar at a time when clergy were regarded as numbering among the intellectuals in society, but his son failed to exhibit any indication that he would follow suit. Young Wilson was unable to read until he was 12 years old and didn't master the alphabet until the age of 9, leading modern-day experts to believe that he may have had a learning disability such as dyslexia. However, his father was actively involved in his son's training, and he taught the boy the skills of oratory and debating, which would strike a chord in Wilson's educational evolution and prove to be a useful skill in his later career. At 16, Wilson was not academically prepared for higher learning. Nonetheless, he attended Davidson College, which was near the family home in North Carolina. He actually did rather well in his subjects, standing out in logic and rhetoric, Latin, English, and composition, and managing to pass Greek and mathematics. However, after a year, he dropped out, possibly because of his faltering health, loneliness from missing his family, or stress from seeing how his father had recently been forced to resign from the faculty of Columbia Theological Seminary. In 1875, Wilson transferred to the College of New Jersey, which would be renamed Princeton in 1896. He majored in history but didn't obtain all of his learning from his classes, choosing to read on his own, particularly on the subject of British history. He was active as a member of the university debating clubs, was an officer of the Princeton Baseball and Football Associations, acted in plays, wrote essays, and edited the university newspaper. His article on cabinet government in the United States was published soon after his graduation. Graduating 37th in a class of 167, Wilson followed his undergraduate studies with a law degree at the University of Virginia, where, in addition to his pursuit of the law degree, he continued to hone his skills as a member of the debating club. He set up his law practice in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1882, but that didn't last long. The life of an attorney failed to capture his interest. He left the law to attend Johns Hopkins University, where he earned his Ph.D. in history and political science in 1886. Wilson is the only American president to have earned such an advanced degree. His dissertation, Congressional Government, a Study in American Politics, became a classic in American political science. It presented his argument against the dominance that Congress held over government while the executive branch was weak in the aftermath of the Civil War. He spoke in favor of substituting the British parliamentary system for the American style of government. He also published a series of history books, which drew heavily from the growing trend of New South revisionism or lost cause revisionism. This distorted the truth about the Civil War and Reconstruction, portraying the South in a more favorable light. Wilson supported this narrative, denouncing slavery on economic grounds, praising terrorist groups like the KKK, and demeaning Reconstruction as a punishment for the South. This narrative legitimized Jim Crow laws which Wilson supported. He added to the ideology of American exceptionalism, a racist form of progressivism, combining it with his evangelical father's views and the social gospel's new idea. Wilson believed that America was chosen by God's grace to be the exemplary country for all others and had a duty to push its values internationally. Wilson experienced poor health. He suffered from strokes during his presidency. Additionally, his early history indicates that he had suffered from atherosclerosis well before he was elected. It's believed that his first stroke may have been in 1896, when he was a professor at Princeton. The condition, which manifested itself with weakness of the right upper limb along with sensory disturbances in his fingers, was diagnosed as neuritis, but it left Wilson unable to write normally for nearly a year. In 1904, he again experienced sensations of weakness in the right upper limb. This lasted for several months. 2 years later, without warning, he suffered vision loss in his left eye, accompanied again by the right upper limb weakness. The vision loss continued. These problems would continue to strike him with regularity and were likely exacerbated by uncontrolled high blood pressure, which in later years caused him to suffer from serious headaches. Personal health in an ordinary citizen is a private matter, but Wilson's to play a dramatic role in American history. In 1883, when he was in Atlanta, he met Ellen Louise Axon, who, like Wilson, was the child of a Presbyterian minister. She had had a formidable education, having enrolled in Georgia's Rome Female College when she was 11, where she studied French, literature, composition, art, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, philosophy, botany, and logic before postgraduate work in German, French, and art. She was vastly superior in education to most of the young men who showed an interest in her. She, like Wilson, was a Southerner. Her father, like Wilson's father, had been a loyal Confederate. Ellen Axon was not a demure young woman who regarded herself as subservient. In fact, she actually doubted that she would find a man who deserved her. Ellen moved to New York in 1881 to take classes in sculpture, drawing, and painting. One of her classes, to which only the most skilled students were admitted, had both draped and nude live models for the class to draw, a daring curriculum for the times, especially with female students. After graduating, she continued to work in portrait art and received a medal for one of her submissions to an international Parisian art show. Her return to Georgia was a fortunate occurrence for Wilson, who upon meeting her was struck by what he described as her laughing eyes. Wilson, who was 28 years of age, married Ellen, age 25, on June 24, 1885, at her paternal grandparents' home in Savannah, Georgia. Ellen was strongly influenced by the arts, but she was also a woman with a powerful sense of commitment to social causes. These views would later influence her husband to be more aware of the needs of the poor. Her social conscience would eventually make her a White House activist on behalf of the less fortunate. The Wilsons would have 3 daughters: Margaret, born in 1886, Jessie, born in 1887, and Eleanor, born in 1889. In 1885, the Wilsons moved to Pennsylvania, where Woodrow would teach political economy and public law at Bryn Mawr College. In 1888, Wilson accepted the position of professor of history at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, winning tenure with his publication of The State, which was a study of comparative government. Within 2 years, he was back at Princeton, this time as a professor of law and political economy. The Wilsons would stay at Princeton for 12 years, where he would become a popular professor and also the author of 9 books, including a 5-volume history of the United States and a biography of the nation's first president, George Washington. Wilson felt driven to subjects such as the lopsided distribution of wealth in society. According to him, the entrepreneurial success of the titans of industry had brought poverty to most Americans. Wilson believed that the president should have the power to keep the business class under control so that the public would have more opportunities. His views, which were published in Harper's and other magazines, earned him a national following. The progressive movement was gaining momentum as Americans began to notice the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Although he was not a clergyman, the trustees of Princeton offered Wilson the position of president of the university in 1902, the first time that the post had been occupied by someone not trained for the priesthood. Wilson made some radical changes. Using the model of Oxford University, Wilson had instructors work with small groups of students instead of the usual impersonal format. He redesigned the curriculum and the departments as well. At first he enjoyed support for the changes. That would change after 1906. His plans for the building of a new graduate college and his goal of having common meals and dormitories rather than exclusive eating clubs and residential houses were opposed by other Princeton traditionalists who distrusted his zeal for reform. Eventually, the opposition of the Princeton dean and the alumni kept him embroiled in academic infighting. The stresses of these actions may have been a contributing factor to his stroke in 1906. There were other stresses in his life of a personal nature. In 1907, following the stroke, Wilson's doctor ordered him to rest. He went to Bermuda, where he met a married woman named Mary Ellen Hobart Peck. Wilson and Mrs. Peck had an extramarital affair that then turned into a friendship which continued with letters and visits. Mrs. Peck sued her husband for divorce in 1911, and rumors about the relationship would surface during the 1912 presidential campaign. Ellen knew about the relationship but was apparently tolerant of her husband's friendship with Mrs. Peck. She even invited her husband's ex-lover to the White House to visit them after Wilson became president. Wilson sought to serve on a broader stage. His ambition was to become a senator and eventually president. He believed that it was God's will for him to hold this office. The Democratic Party of New Jersey had noticed Woodrow Wilson and suggested that he run for governor in the 1910 election. Wilson was willing to do so, but he was wary of the powerful political machine that ran state politics behind the scenes. New Jersey voters were disgusted with the corruption and scandals that had caught their attention, and party bosses wanted a candidate who had a reputation for honesty to counteract their own image for unsavory dealings. Wilson said that he would run as long as there were no strings attached and he didn't owe them favors. The wily party movers and shakers figured that the Princeton professor would be a puppet in their hands, and when he won the nomination for governor on the first ballot, these bosses thought that they'd made the smart choice. They didn't calculate that Wilson would defy the power of the political leaders by announcing his independence from their control. Wilson beat his Republican opponent. As governor, he was able to promote legislation that showed the professional politicians that the college professor wasn't as naive as they'd hoped. Wilson enacted laws requiring that all elected officials in New Jersey took part in party primaries, and that candidates filed campaign finance disclosures. Corporate contributions to political campaigns were made illegal, and campaign spending was limited. Wilson's progressive agenda also called for a workers' compensation law to provide assistance for families when a worker was killed or hurt on the job. The establishment of a public utility commission was empowered to set rates. After a year in office, Wilson attracted the attention of William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic Party's shining star, who had already run for president 3 times and was a dominant figure in national politics. National politics was no more pristine than state politics when the Democrats held their convention in Baltimore in 1912. There was jockeying among the candidates. After 14 ballots, another candidate appeared to have advantage. William Jennings Bryan was concerned that the powerful Tammany Hall political machine had cut a deal with the party bosses and business interests, so he gave his support to Wilson. The usual wheeling and dealing went on until Wilson began to emerge with more delegates. By the 46th ballot, he was the Democratic candidate for president. The Democratic platform was decidedly progressive in its goals. It supported reductions in corporate campaign contributions, reductions in tariffs, stronger antitrust laws, banking reform, a federal income tax, direct election of senators, independence for the Philippines, which had come under American control after the Spanish-American War, and a single term for presidents. The year 1912 was a pivotal one in politics. The Republican Party had nominated incumbent President William Taft to run for a second term. Former President Teddy Roosevelt, running as a progressive, was the candidate of the Bull Moose Party. The issue of women's suffrage was a topic which all 3 candidates addressed. Ellen Wilson, although she believed that women should be allowed to vote, would not publicly voice her views in order to avoid diverging from her husband's stance. With the Republican vote effectively split between the 2 candidates, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate for president, continued to campaign as a reformer. He won 435 electoral votes and the White House with almost 42% of the popular vote, defeating the other 2 candidates including the popular Roosevelt, who earned 27% of the vote. Over a year into his presidency, in August 1914, Wilson learned that his wife Ellen was suffering from Bright's disease, a condition which affected the kidneys. The illness was terminal and the First Lady died as a result. As she was dying, she told Wilson that the thoughts of her death would be easier to bear if the alley clearance bill providing housing assistance to the poor would pass. When Congress learned of her dying wish, the bill passed. Before she died, she made her doctor promise that he would take care of her husband. Knowing that Wilson was not a man destined to remain alone, the dying woman told her husband that she wanted him to remarry someday. The First Lady passed on August 6, 1914. Her husband was devastated by the loss. The couple, despite Wilson's episode of infidelity, were close throughout their married years. As Wilson grieved for his personal loss, the eyes of the world were on Europe, where in August 1914, the assassination of an obscure Austrian archduke had triggered a global conflict that saw the powers of the old world locked into a terrible conflict. America, strongly isolationist, wanted no part of this foreign conflict, and Wilson was determined to keep the country out of war. Wilson had enough to occupy himself with at home. The United States was a changing nation. During the 2 terms that Wilson served as president, the population increased by 15%, almost 6 million of the 105.7 million Americans now living in the country had arrived after 1910. When he took office in 1913, most Americans lived on farms. By the time he left office in 1920, more people lived in urban, rather than rural, settings. Wilson was 56 years old, and from the beginning of his presidency he supported reform. The theme of his program was called the New Freedom Platform and was designed to give American farmers and small businessmen more opportunity. The Underwood-Simmons Act reduced tariffs on imports. During his first administration, the 8-hour workday for railroad employees was established. Child labor laws were passed. Farmers received government loans. Like Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson was a reformer, but he had a vision of presidential powers that changed the role of the executive branch. Under Wilson, the presidency would become the most powerful of the three branches of government, putting Congress in a subordinate position, working the way that a prime minister in a parliamentary model worked. In April 1913, Wilson called a special session of Congress to influence acceptance of tariff reform. The president appeared before a joint session of the Senate and the House of Representatives and laid out his plans. The last president to address Congress in person had been John Adams. Democrats had wanted a more flexible money supply for some time so that the banking system could, during times when the economy was either expanding or contracting, adjust the amount of credit and money that was available. Financial panics had made Wilson aware that too much of the country's financial wealth was held by a few small, powerful banks and corporations. The Federal Reserve Act, passed in 1913, established 12 reserve banks created by a federal agency which could adjust the nation's supply of money when circumstances called for it, as well as adjusting interest rates. The Clayton Antitrust Act, passed in 1914, followed through on Wilson's campaign promise to end business practices such as price fixing and the practice of interlocking directorates, which saw executive boards for competing companies of a particular industry sharing the same people as members. That same year, the Federal Trade Commission law was passed, creating a federal board anointed by the president with the task of investigating unfair and corrupt business practices. A major contradiction to Wilson's New Freedom, however, was Wilson's subvert posture supporting his cabinet in segregating the federal workforce, which led to African Americans losing their jobs and being relegated to menial positions. This obvious racism had not happened before, leading to protests by Republicans and civil rights leaders meeting with Wilson to dissuade him from this policy. Despite their efforts, Wilson believed that this was part of his new liberalism and thought that it would improve race relations. In reality, it significantly diminished black people's opportunities and brought Jim Crow to the federal government. In 1915, on another racist display, the movie The Birth of a Nation was screened in the White House, in essence legitimizing it. Wilson praised it. As a prominent lost cause historian, Wilson's stance and the movie contributed to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The marriage of Woodrow and Ellen Wilson had been a partnership. She had supported his political ambitions and shared in the campaign. Wilson valued her insights and intelligence. When she died, he lost not only a wife but a political ally. After her death, he seemed to be in a daze as he went about the business of running the country, and was so distraught that he reportedly said he wished that someone would shoot him. Wilson was a man who thrived in the company of women, not someone likely to remain a grieving widower for long. After his wife's death, Wilson's cousin Helen Woodrow Bones had assumed the duties of the official White House hostess. In March 1915, she introduced the president to Edith Balling Galt, who, like him, was a Southerner and had lost her spouse. Edith Balling Galt was born in 1872 in Virginia. Family legend said that her ancestry could be traced back to Pocahontas. Along the way were ties of kinship to Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson. She had briefly attended college, but unlike Ellen Axon Wilson, who thrived in academic settings, she left after 2 terms. Prior to becoming a widow, Edith was married to Norman Galt and lived a prosperous life running a business in Washington, D.C. Edith, who was 15 years younger than the president, managed to conquer Wilson soon after meeting him. When he proposed to her, he discounted the brief amount of time that they had known each other, but the public was not enamored of their president's whirlwind courtship of another woman so soon after the death of his first wife. Rumors spread that Wilson had been unfaithful to Ellen, and that he and Edith had conspired to murder his first wife. When Wilson told Edith that she could break off the engagement, she declined. However, she decided to postpone the wedding date until an official year of mourning for Ellen Wilson had concluded. On December 18, 1915, with 40 guests present, Woodrow Wilson and Edith Galt were married at her townhouse in Washington, D.C. The prevalence of gossip had convinced the couple not to be married at the White House, where a wedding would have attracted more attention from the press and the public. After a 2-week honeymoon in Virginia and West Virginia, the President and the new First Lady returned to the White House. Edith Wilson was prepared to take on the responsibilities of First Lady, but first there was a presidential campaign to run. Wilson had accomplished much during his first term, but the 1916 election had him facing a Republican Party which was united. The shadow of war hung over the election, and even though Wilson ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," he knew that he could not guarantee that this situation could be maintained. He was a strong advocate for American neutrality, but in the meantime he wanted the nation's military forces to be prepared in case neutrality ceased to be an option. However, Irish Americans and German Americans were troubled by the juxtaposition of neutrality and military preparedness, and their voices were strong during the campaign. Running on a platform advocating military preparedness, a ban on child labor, an association of the world's nations to maintain peace after the global war ended, Pan-American unity, prison reform, and women's suffrage, Wilson remained true to his reformer roots. When Wilson first became president, he was opposed to women's suffrage. However, as the movement grew, Wilson's views changed and would continue to do so throughout the rest of his presidency and his life, so that, by 1918, he would be ready to publicly endorse the right of women to vote. One of the potential Republican candidates for the office was former President Theodore Roosevelt, whose candidacy in 1912 as a member of the Bull Moose Party had split the Republican vote. Republicans weren't the only ones with a grudge against Roosevelt. He himself believed that the U.S. should enter the war, and he accused Wilson of being a coward. He chastised the hyphenated Americans of Irish descent who opposed the war because they regarded Great Britain as equally tyrannical as Germany. With so much political baggage, Theodore Roosevelt was destined not to be his party's candidate for president. Charles Evans Hughes was the Republican candidate, and he had a good chance of winning. The Republicans had a longer history of winning the nation's highest office in the years following the Civil War. The Democrats had only won 3 presidential elections since 1850. Also, the enthusiasm for progressive reforms had waned, jeopardizing Wilson's chances for re-election. But Republican confidence in victory was in error. Election day revealed that Wilson had won an admittedly narrow victory in both the popular vote and the Electoral College. Wilson's base, which consisted of the labor unions, immigrants who detested the British, the German Americans who didn't want to see their adoptive country at war against their ancestral home, socialites and progressives, as well as women in the western states that permitted female suffrage, came through. Wilson is the only American president who was elected to office both times without having won a popular majority. Isolationism and an aversion to being dragged into the quagmire of European politics inspired in most Americans an ardent desire to avoid the war which had broken out in 1914. Wilson felt that Europe had brought the war on itself because of militant nationalism. Wilson also faced a far different demographic reality than the heads of the European powers. Nearly 1 in every 7 Americans had been born in one of the countries which had gone to war in 1914. Neutrality seemed the best option for the nation of immigrants. However, the economy benefited from selling its products to the British and French, in part because of a recession which had been in effect when war broke out. Feeling that American neutrality actually favored the Allies, Germany's response was to blockade Great Britain with its submarine fleet in the hopes that Wilson would refuse to allow Americans to travel on British or American passenger ships and that he would stop selling weapons to the Allied nations. Staying neutral was a challenge for the country. In May 1915, the British ocean liner Lusitania was torpedoed by a German submarine. Of the 1,100 people who were killed, 128 were Americans. The Germans had suspected that the British ocean liner was carrying more than civilians, and they were right. The ship had been built with the intention of being able to carry weapons. However, in the eyes of the world, Germany was the aggressor, and Wilson warned the Germans that if submarines sank any additional ships, the action would be regarded as a hostile one by the United States. Germany did not want the Americans to enter the war and dedicated a considerable effort to spreading pro-German propaganda in the country. Although Wilson was elected on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," during the 1916 election, 1917 proved to be a very different matter after Germany resumed submarine warfare. The Germans realized that this act would bring the US into the war, but bargained on being able to first destroy the British Navy and launch a mighty attack against the Allies. However, when American ships were sunk by the Germans and the Zimmermann telegram was publicized, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917. Congress complied. The United States would, Wilson said, fight to ensure democratic self-government and the rights and liberties of the less powerful nations. Also, he emphatically supported the creation of an international organization that, according to him, would end wars. Wilson switched from his reformer agenda to mobilization. The government created agencies that were staffed by volunteers. The agencies were designed to last only as long as the war. Bernard Baruch, a New York stock market investor, was put in charge of the War Industries Board with the assignment to coordinate industrial production. Under his leadership, production increased by 20%. Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer who would later rise to the presidency himself, was appointed to coordinate a relief program for Belgium, which was occupied by the Germans. Hoover managed to convince American farmers to expand their production at a swift pace, which meant that not only could the U.S. feed its own civilian and soldier population, but it could also provide food for the Allies. A new income tax was levied that would cover almost half of the $33 billion that the war would come to cost. The remainder of the cost was funded by Liberty loan drives, which saw civilians purchasing Liberty bonds. The First Lady did her part to make sure that the White House supported the war effort. She adhered to the schedule of gasless Sundays, meatless Mondays, and wheatless Wednesdays that Hoover had initiated. Because so many men had enlisted, it wasn't easy to get gardeners to take care of the landscaping, but the First Lady let sheep graze on the White House lawn. She auctioned off the White House wool to benefit the American Red Cross. Wilson relied on her, as he had done his first wife, to serve in a political capacity as well as a domestic one. The First Lady was kept informed of state matters. She was given access to the secret code for confidential war documents. When there were meetings in the Oval Office, Edith was often with him. During her youth, Edith had not paid a great deal of attention to politics, but as the First Lady, she dedicated herself to supporting her husband in whatever capacity was needed. More than 2 million men were drafted to fight in the war. Most Americans saw patriotism and a pro-war stance as inevitable, but this period of time also saw the growth of the American Socialist Party, which represented the views of those people who opposed the war. To promote the war, Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, which trained its volunteer writers, actors, artists, lecturers, and scholars to be able to make a 4-minute speech whenever a crowd of people gathered. A result of the patriotic, pro-American fervor created a backlash against immigrants, as some states passed laws forbidding them to speak their native languages in public. Anti-German hostility extended to the point where communities banned playing music by Bach and Beethoven. Many German Americans anglicized their names to avoid attacks, beatings, and lynchings by native-born Americans. The Espionage and Sedition Acts made it illegal to criticize the government, the military, or the war effort, and violators such as the famed leader of the Socialist Party Eugene V. Debs were arrested when they disobeyed this law. Mail was censored. Many Americans were outraged by what they perceived as the loss of their civil liberties, but the Supreme Court ruled that the acts were constitutional. For the 400,000 African American soldiers who served, their time in the military was an unfortunate reminder that they were still a subjugated race. The army units were segregated, the Navy used black troops for food service jobs, and the Marines didn't allow them to serve in any capacity. The Allies were badly in need of the infusion of new troops, and the arrival of the Americans gave the Allied cause new hope. The Germans mounted an offensive in the spring of 1918. The Allies, with the inclusion of the Americans, were able to launch a counteroffensive in July of that year. The U.S. soldiers weren't battle-tested, but they weren't battle-weary either. The Allies were able to force the Germans back, and by early November the Germans were ready for an armistice. Compared to the millions of soldiers and civilians that the Europeans lost during the war, American losses of 115,000 men didn't seem like much. However, the Spanish influenza, a global pandemic which devastated populations, would kill 600,000 Americans both overseas and at home. The war to end all wars was finally over, and President Wilson was ready to make that name an accurate title. As the foundation of the peace treaty, Wilson proposed his 14 points. The final point was the creation of a League of Nations, which would have the power to arbitrate among the nations with the aim of sustaining peace. America had come through the war well. The young nation had not been prepared for the massive military engagement of World War I, but it had risen to the task, and the American economy demonstrated its resilience and capacity for efficiency thanks to the various volunteers who were involved in the effort. When the war ended, those agencies likewise ended their work, reducing the federal government to levels that were close to its size before the war. Expenditures also fell back to what they had been prior to the declaration of war. The United States had not suffered as greatly as had the Allied nations, and Great Britain and especially France wanted harsh and exemplary punishment for Germany. Wilson sailed for France in December 1918 as head of the American peace delegation. It was the first time that a sitting American president had traveled to Europe. First Lady Edith Wilson traveled with him. It was also the first time that a First Lady had traveled with her husband on a diplomatic mission. The Europeans greeted him as a hero, grateful to the American president whose soldiers had played a vital part in ending the war. Wilson's goal through the peace treaties was to avoid a return to the imperialism and militarism which had dominated Europe before the war, and to check the advance of communism as the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia spread its beliefs. He was determined to prevent either situation from happening. Wilson had delivered his 14-point speech to Congress well before the war ended, intent on persuading legislators that Europe needed to be saved from itself. The various covert treaties, which had dragged so many countries into the war, would end. Instead, a new diplomacy would be based on transparency. All of the territory that had been occupied during the war would have to be evacuated. Colonial territories would be guided toward self-rule. Germany and Austria would have to give up their military, general disarmament would follow. Russia would be treated fairly. Free trade would be guaranteed. Finally, the League of Nations would oversee disarmament and colonial dismantling. All democratic nations would be eligible to join. The League would bring in a new era of world peace. However, the Allies were intractable. Wilson wished only for complete German disbarment, but the Allies also wanted reparations and territorial occupation. Wilson should have and could have restrained the Allies, but to gain support for his 14 points, he just went along with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, France's Georges Clemenceau, and Italy's Vittorio Orlando, who followed through on their intention to make the Germans suffer. The seeds for future belligerence and eventually War World II had been planted. The treaty that Wilson brought home, although it included the League of Nations among its points, was not what he had presented to Congress before he left for France. The Republican Party controlled the Senate. Wilson, triumphant after the war and adulated abroad, decided to disregard this fact. He did not bring any Republicans to France and failed to make the negotiations a bipartisan show of American unity. Some Republicans led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, opposed the formation of the League of Nations because they felt that American independence would be compromised. Other Republicans wanted to return to America's former isolationist stance and advocated complete non-involvement in world affairs. Instead of mediating with the Senate and accept a middle ground, Wilson tried to bypass the Senate, going directly to the people. He traveled over 9,000 miles making speeches in 29 cities on behalf of the League of Nations. This decision infuriated the Senate and in the end turned to be his demise. The physical effort was draining and finally, he collapsed on the bathroom floor while in Colorado, suffering a stroke that left him half paralyzed. He never fully recovered. In the end, the Senate did not approve the establishment of the League of Nations. Wilson's peace dreams were over. Wilson's condition made of Edith the president's intermediary with Congress. She refused to consider Wilson's resignation from the office of president, and would not consider the prospect of allowing the vice president to substitute for Wilson during his illness. Mrs. Wilson examined the medical information that was dispensed to Congress, the cabinet, and the public, making certain that the wording gave no indication of how seriously ill Wilson was. It was highly irregular, but there was as yet no official process by which the vice president would take over the duties of president if the latter were unable to perform them. Edith said, "I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband." This obviously created much speculation. Edith's involvement continued from October 1919 until March 1921. On March 4, 1921, Woodrow Wilson traveled to the Capitol for the inauguration of Warren G. Harding, the Republican president who had been elected in 1920. He and Edith then retired to the home they had purchased in Washington, D.C. Wilson tried the idea of a law partnership. However, Wilson was no longer physically fit for that endeavor. Woodrow Wilson died on February 3, 1924, and was buried in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Wilson remained in Washington, D.C. and would ride in the inaugural parade for President John F. Kennedy in 1961. She died later that year, on December 28, the anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's birth. In 1920, Wilson was awarded the Nobel Prize for the role he played in bringing World War I to an end and for his efforts to create the League of Nations. Wilson had recognized that a global war, which had overflowed out of the boiling pot of European territorial issues, arms buildup, and colonialism, had the power to devastate a civilization. However, his sole solution for this was the creation of an international organization that could mediate between countries. He failed to recognize that an organization alone could not deal with deep-rooted opposing foreign interests. Wilson could have played perhaps one of the most transcendental roles of the 20th century had he acted upon the newly and unique influence acquired by the United States at the culmination of the war. He could have deterred the Allies from imposing such stiff conditions on Germany, probably averting World War II. He could have pressured France to walk away from its colonial ambitions in Indochina, probably averting developments that brought the Vietnam War. Also, he could have broken off France's and England's Treaty of Partition resulting from the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which encompassed North Africa and the Middle East, probably averting much of the political instability, social fragmentation, authoritarianism, and violence that followed in that region. Obsession with the League of Nations and his idealism in the end blinded Wilson. He thus took no direct course of action aimed at the immediate issues that in the end were the cause of much conflict during the remaining of the 20th century. His legacy instead came alive when the Second World War ended, the United Nations was formed. Much credit for this went to Wilson. Wilson left ample room for criticism. He did nothing to advance the lot of African Americans. He came late to the cause of women's suffrage, although he did finally support women's right to vote. During the war years, he was guilty of violating American civil liberties, as he refused to allow dissent. He supported democracy and self-determination, stating that it could only strengthen the nations of the world. However, much of this assertion was rhetoric, as in practice it was meant only for parts of Europe and North America. Contradicting this policy, Wilson's presidency saw several military actions including Mexico and Central America. Wilson's foreign policy and American interventions in Mexico were controversial. During Wilson's presidency, Mexico was undergoing a revolution that saw various factions vying for power. Wilson supported Porfirio Diaz and his followers. In 1911 he incited the overthrow of Francisco Madero, at the time the only true Democrat, enabling Victorino Huerta to seize power. Such preference soon proved fatal as Madero was assassinated and Huerta turned into a ruthless dictator. In 1914, Wilson sent troops into Mexico to pursue the revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, who had attacked the border town of Columbus, New Mexico. The U.S. Army pursued Villa into Mexico, but the mission was unsuccessful. Relations with then-President Venustiano Carranza, with whom a friendly approach had been sought, turned sour. Similarly, citing the need to protect American interests abroad, Wilson ordered U.S. troops to occupy Nicaragua in both 1912 and 1916, and then Haiti in 1915. U.S. forces remained until 1933 in the former and 1934 in the latter. All such incursions run against Wilson's stated principles of democracy and self-determination and were carried out without regards to local citizens. Following on Theodore Roosevelt's steps under Wilson, Americans continued adopting a less isolationist stance. Full abandonment of isolationism came after World War II. His reforms transformed the banking system, tariffs, financial support for farmers and education, business, and labor. The Democrats under his leadership evolved into the political party that supported reform and the care of the ordinary American. Under Wilson, the Democratic Party changed from an organization largely controlled by political bosses into one that was more in line with a progressive agenda. His reforms were for the benefit of the ordinary citizen who felt oppressed by the robber barons, business tycoons, party bosses, and monopolies that favored the powerful. Wilson viewed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia with deep suspicion and was intolerant of American socialism, movements which gained momentum as disgruntled Americans considered the injustice of their lots in life. The Southern preacher's kid who lived through the Civil War led the United States into world dominance. Had he seized the moment, the 28th president could have been of the greatest consequence in the 20th century.